Yeah, you see this? You see this about 30 FPS here? Now, watch this. Boom. Just like that, now we're doing a solid 110 plus. And hey there! So, as you saw from that opening, anti-aliasing alone was the difference between unplayable and playable, with quite high FPS at that. Did not need to touch literally anything else. And diving into that is going to be the topic of today's video. The impact of anti-aliasing, both performance-wise and visually, on a super high PPD display like the Crystal here, but also a brief look at some lower PPD ones like the AKX. Headsets like the Crystal and the Vario Aero, consumer VR is starting to get to such high pixel densities that it's beginning to reach monitor territory. 35 PPD versus most modern headsets falling around 20, 25-ish, something like that. That is a huge difference, a massive. And if you've played on a high resolution at flat screen, you may have noticed stuff like anti-aliasing is sometimes less needed at 4K compared to, say, 1080p. So we're going to see if the same thing applies to VR or not. The three forms of AA we're going to be looking at are MSAA, the most popular form of AA for VR, FXAA, which is not too commonly used, and then we have, lastly, TAA, which is also kind of rare in VR. All this is going to be done on the Pimax Crystal at 4252 by 529 resolution with a 4090, 12900K, and 6000 MHz CL30 DDR5 RAM. Unless noted otherwise, all in-game settings are going to be maxed out. Please do bear in mind, though, that certain things may be more or a little less noticeable within the actual HMD, as I am really pixel peeping here to be sure. And if I am heavily refresh rate limited, I'll be using the frame timings in milliseconds to illustrate the difference. One final note before we do jump into the analysis. Let me briefly explain what the various types of AA do, why they're important, and why we might get the results we do. Firstly, we have MSAA, which stands for Multi-Sample Anti-Aliasing. Now, the name comes from, as you may guess, the fact that MSAA will use multiple samples along the edges of the objects to eliminate the jagged lines around it. It's kind of like super sampling, but only around the edges of the objects. And so it is more efficient than simply cranking the resolution way up. However, as you still might guess from that, it's still quite performance heavy, and the more samples you use, the greater the cost. So then, what is TAA, and why is it popular in flat screen, but MSAA is mainly used in VR? Well, temporal anti-aliasing, as the name implies, uses a temporal component where it uses information from the previous frames to blend the samples together and eliminate aliasing to approximate how something should look in order to remove the jaggies. Which makes it much more performant than the rather brute force method something like MSAA uses. The problem with this is, TAA has a bit of a bad reputation for blurring the image, ghosting, and just general issues with blunting the fidelity of it. One reason this is caused is because due to jitter that can come from this, particularly when it comes to motion, because it relies on the previous frame data, so if you suddenly change everything on screen at once, or even just slightly change it, that can potentially cause some issues. Now, in VR, your head is always moving ever so slightly. Even if you don't notice it, the game engine sure does. And so the weaknesses of TAA in this problem can become even more exaggerated. And higher res and pixel density can mitigate this, so we're going to talk a little bit about that later, though. Lastly, we have Fast Approximate Anti-Aliasing, or FXAA for short. This, essentially, works by doing things like selectively reducing contrast and blurring the lines by approximating where the edges of the object are to smooth them out, which should make the jaggies less obvious since it's blending them together. But this can also result in a loss of detail and slight blurring. In the end, though, these all share the same goal, and that's to eliminate the artifacting, the shimmer seen at the edges of objects. But it is not as simple as just more expensive is better. which is the reason I made the video. And so let's get the analysis started, shall we? So, first up on this is one of the benchmarks for VR visuals, Half-Life Alyx, which supports both MSAA and FXAA via the launch commands with these two right here. Dynamic resolution is also disabled for these benchmarks. So let's start by briefly flashing through what's been tested here and look at the full image before doing some side-by-sides and closer inspection. Starting with no AA as our control, followed by FXAA, which can be enabled via the mentioned command, then MSAA times 2, and finally MSAA times 4, which is what Alyx uses by default. I bet you've already noticed a couple obvious differences, but let's take a closer look at a few key spots. First up are the wires out in front of us. These have to be one of the things most hurt by no AA. Even with the crystal's high PPD, the shimmer here is rather notable. Certain parts of the thin wires seem to even flash in and out of existence. FXAA does slightly clean it up, but jaggies are still quite present. Meanwhile, even MSAA times 2 has a significant improvement on the overall stability of the lines. As I said before, certain things are more obvious in the actual headset, so there's a little bit more shimmer shown here, but it's still impressively cleaned up versus no AA. Then there's times 4. The improvement to image quality is quite minor. I suppose it's there if you really look closely, but just going from times 2 to times 4 is a huge penalty to your frames that's well into diminishing returns. For a quick comparison, here is how the 8KX, roughly 20 PPD versus the 35 of the Crystal, and recorded at the same bit rate, looks with no AA, and then MSAA times 4. It's even more obvious, but the lack of AA is truly otherworldly bad on the 8KX. And while there's less shimmer than the Crystal with no AA when using times 4 on it, it looks close to even slightly worse than the Crystal with times 2, in my opinion. And this is going to be the kind of trend we see going forward. But going inside to look at something with a lot more detail and up close, we see the story start to change a little bit. Again, I'm going to briefly flash through each run to show the performance and image. Even without any AA, the shimmer is nowhere near as bad indoors and with up-close objects. Yes, there is still some here, but it's small enough I bet that most people who aren't pixel peeping would overlook some of it. And even FXAA largely cleans up what little there is, coming close to MSAA times 2 here. However, the performance delta becomes even more obvious here. Really, there is no reason to use MSAA times 4 at this high pixel density, but let's go to another game and look at some more forms of AA. Next up here is Medal of Honor, which features both MSAA alongside TAA. And boy, I got some interesting observations off of that. Starting again with our control of no AA, in this office with a bunch of things layered around and closer, but not right in our face, we can see the shimmer is much better controlled versus the rooftop shot from Alyx, though it's definitely still present. Going to MSAA times 2, as expected, the image quality does get fairly cleaned up, but there's still a performance penalty that's dropping us from a reasonably solid 90 FPS down to more 75-ish. As for MSAA times 4, yeah, sure, it cleans up the visuals a bit more, but at the same time, we are sub 50 FPS, which is unplayable. I think I've made my point about MSAA times 4 is generally well into diminishing returns because this is on the 4090, and we'd be counting frames per minute on anything less. Switching to TAA, look at that! The shimmering is basically gone. Not improved, not mitigated, gone. It does even better than MSAA times 4 does, and look at our FPS. Close to 0 AA levels of performance. Sounds great, right? Well, there's a trade-off to this, and it's the reason TAA is so maligned by people. Let's take a look at the Soviet words on the map. Notice how TAA, they have become noticeably blurred in comparison to every other setting. The reason for that is due to how AA works, and I mentioned in the opening, it's using information from previously rendered frames as AA for the current one. Many people don't like this in VR because of the fact your head is constantly moving, and so TAA's weaknesses end up exaggerated because even a slight shift in movement and some jittering of your head can mess with it. However, there are many interesting things to point out about TAA here, and I think that are unique to higher PPD headsets versus lower ones. Look at how the same text appears on the 8KX with TAA. It's slightly better inside the actual HMD, but the text may as well have been blended entirely together. On lower pixel density displays, temporal anti-aliasing completely murders the image quality because there's not as much detail to begin with, and you're already at lower fidelity. But on super high resolution displays, such as the Crystal, the raw clarity helps blunt some of TAA's problems. On the 8KX, the text is just slightly above unrecognizable tier, and the whole screen feels truly smeared with Vaseline. Whereas with the Crystal, you can at least make out what the text is supposed to be, so there's, I think, a legitimate trade-off between sacrificing a little bit of image quality and sharpness, but getting rid of all of the jaggy. Or take a performance hit in a small amount of jaggies, but keep a sharp image with MSAA. Except, look what happens when we add contrast adaptive sharpening using the VR Perf Kit, link in the description, with 1.0 sharpness and resolution, so no upscaling. The difference here is stunning. The blur issue that TAA causes is basically entirely gone, leaving you with an image that's actually sharper than the default actually. And yes, to be clear, you can sharpen the other settings too, but sharpening won't get rid of the still present shimmer, and there's noticeably greater performance impact via the other forms of AA, so I don't see the point. With this, you are effectively getting the best of both worlds here, and I think it's truly impressive. But let's move on to another game that shows why implementation matters. Here we have Into the Radius, which features MSAA and TAA, but the general trend should be pretty clear on the performance. MSAA, which the game doesn't specify to what degree it's using, but assuming times 4, kills frames to absurd levels when compared to no AA or TAA. The first thing I'd also like to point out is the extreme artifacting on the grading in the middle left. With no AA, it is actually abysmal and is the worst shimmering I saw in any of my tests. It's seizure-inducing without AA. TAA does a good job at removing this for a small performance penalty, but it's definitely a bad artifact still. MSAA removes most of the black artifacting, but the general shimmer remains even with this high level of AA. But in other places, I would honestly say that TAA is largely matching or even exceeding MSAA. Let's look at the left half of the scene, as a few things stand out even without zooming into Pixel Peep. On the yellow sign, even MSAA has some distracting as hell shimmering on the Explorers Must Always Have text. That is only slightly better than with no AA, but with TAA, it's impressively stable with no shimmer. And if we look at the light directly above the gate, TAA is arguably exceeding MSAA here too, with noticeably less shimmer and better performance. But most interestingly is that, compared to Medal of Honor, there does not seem to be noticeable blurring of fine details, particularly text. Even when looking at a slightly more distant text, such as the logo at the top of the building, there is a slight loss of detail and blur, but it's honestly not that bad compared to Medal of Honor, so maybe some sharpening is being pre-applied. This is probably the best implementation I've seen of TAA from a VR game so far, though granted, that's not a very long list. And again, this seems like an advantage of having an extremely high PPD display. The developer even acknowledged this on their performance guide that higher res can mitigate the blurriness. And believe me, I tried this on the 8KX. It did not look anywhere near as good, and the blurring was more noticeable. I didn't have footage of this, as despite my attempts at the recording, it did not really capture the difference compared to Medal of Honor in a way I felt was properly represented. But we have one final game I want to take a look at. And the last up is Survive, which supports MSAA, FXAA, and TAA. It was the only damn game I could find which had all three. I'll make this brief since there's 5 different settings to look at, and by now we're probably easy to start noticing a trend between the various settings. The Jaggies on the floor pattern in particular have some of the worst artifacting in the scene, but any level of AA appears to at least kind of clean that up. Interestingly though, FXAA and MSAA times 2 kinda trade blows here, where each have their own strengths and weaknesses, such as FXAA dealing with the floor grading a little better, but if you look a bit to the side at the bars on the ammo stand, FXAA has much worse artifacting, while MSAA times 2 clears it up much more. But then moving over to the cabinets, FXAA does a better job at the interior lines, yet has some more prominent artifacting on the perimeter of the object, while it's the complete opposite with times 2. MSAA times 4 cleans it up even more, and now completely exceeds FXAA, but again, there's that performance hit. But there's one more place I want to draw attention to, and that's the sign in the back. With no MSAA or AA, the sign is sharp and clear. But with both FXAA and TAA, there are varying degrees of blur. As I mentioned in the opening, FXAA is essentially just detecting where Jaggies could be and smoothing out the edges of it, which can lead to a softer image such as this. And I already covered TAA, which is definitely blurrier than FXAA here. But just like with Medal of Honor, you can still fall back on a CAS. So there is the AA analysis for everyone. Let's talk about a couple general takeaways from this. Firstly, does even a very high PPD like the Crystal benefit from using AA, or does it truly not need it? Well, generally, I would say there are still some rather noticeable benefits from using even low levels of it, depending on the scene and game. But is using the AA still worth it, even with that image quality gains due to the huge performance penalty it can impose? After all, most VR games are going to be using MSAA due to the blurriness that TAA and FXAA cause. Well, again, I think it depends. MSAA is the setting to disable if you need to gain extra performance. As remember, this is on a 4090, and lower end cards are gonna struggle even more. But if MSAA is your only option and you really want to clear up the Jaggies, low levels of anti-aliasing are still relevant. Even MSAA times 2 was a pretty good improvement over none of it. But I would almost never use MSAA beyond that, as times 4 can literally cut your performance in half at times. It's the difference between playable and unplayable there, sometimes even high FPS, and the benefits are incredibly minimal due to diminishing returns. Though, not every game relies just on MSAA, and sometimes you can find FXAA or TAA in games. In that case, are they worth using over MSAA? Well, it's going to come down a bit to implementation, but comparing stock, I think FXAA is close enough to MSAA times 2, outdoing it in some areas while losing in others, that if you are truly starved for performance but want to eliminate some aliasing, it can be worth using. The slight blurring and fidelity loss on the Crystal is pretty minor, especially if you're in enclosed spaces. Whereas TAA is really gonna depend on the implementation, as few games have I seen as good a version as Into the Radius's usage. Alongside how much you hate Jaggies, since TAA just Thanos snaps them out of existence. Even stock though, I think the Crystal's raw clarity is good enough there is a legitimate trade-off to consider between some extra blurriness from TAA, but removing all the Jaggies. Because it's still sharper than lower res HMDs even when using that, though the visuals, which are the main selling point, does get kind of blunted. But that said, I will be perfectly honest, and I think TAA paired with some sharpening, assuming its implementation merits it, provides the best overall image on the Crystal, removing virtually all the Jaggies, still keeping things looking extremely sharp, and having a incredibly minimal performance impact. It is the best of both worlds, basically. And honestly, that's not something I would have ever said on lower fidelity HMDs unless aliasing is the thing you hate the most in VR. I actually kinda wish more games had TAA now. Damn. Anyway, those are my thoughts and analysis of AA on high PPD displays. If you enjoyed this, do let me know in the comments, be it anywhere to improve or what you'd like to see next. Maybe subscribe and stick around and see what else I do if you like this. I plan on doing some 4090 benchmarks on the Crystal a little bit down the road. And thanks for stopping by if I don't see you again. Later.